Redeemers that came. Every one of them is impacted by the sin that took place. And they'll be impacted forever because of the sin. I want to stop here for just a minute, and I actually did this just a few weeks ago at Memorial. I want to talk for just a minute about Adam's sin and sin. I think I did this last week, actually. Sometimes you will have people talk about inherited sin, that we have inherited the sin of Adam. I do not believe that I am born sinful. You were not born sinful. When a baby is born, a baby is perfect. They have no sin. They're wonderful. They're beautiful. They're sweet. Well, they're not all beautiful, but they're all sweet, right? But they are without sin. But we all feel the impact of sin. When I was, and this was the story I shared, I'll share a couple with you in order to make the point. So long before I was born, my dad apparently smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day and a pipe. That is called addicted, isn't it? I never saw him smoke in my lifetime. I think my mother was expecting when they were baptized, which means maybe I've been baptized twice, huh? I never even thought about that. So he was smoking so heavily, and the day after his baptism, he was trying to share with his friend how he needed to be baptized. And his friend said, well, it didn't change your life. Look at you. And he stopped that day and went cold turkey and never smoked again, apparently had hives and withdrawal issues, but never did again. Matter of fact, within a year, he was preaching part-time, and in 2 years, he was preaching full-time. What kind of crazy church would hire him, right? But they did. And he died when I was 12 years old. We found out when I was 7 or 8 that he had cancer. Wonderful man, baptized hundreds of people. That's why we lived in Canadian Texas, is because he was the preacher there. Wonderful man. Well, I felt the impact of growing up without a dad. I felt the impact of that. I still feel it. I felt it on my wedding day. I felt it on graduation days. I feel that. I felt it when my daughters were born. I felt it at my daughter's wedding. I feel that impact. I've never smoked a cigarette in my life. It's not my sin. It was his issue, not mine. But we feel the impact. When we lived in Brazil, our oldest daughter, Annabeth, was a baby. And in those days, we kept our windows open all the time for fresh air. We didn't have air conditioning, and even though it was hot, we had the windows open. We lived right on the coast. We lived in a city called Vitória, and that's the Americanized way to say it. In Vitória, I only tell you that because we have a couple of Brazilian missionaries in here who would correct it. And it's the second deepest port in the world, and it's iron ore comes out of that port, and a lot of it heads straight for Rotterdam, Holland, which is the deepest port. And so that facility that they had for iron ore was huge, and half the city worked there. One of the things that was interesting about our house with the windows open that everybody talked about was that you had to dust 2 or 3 times a day because there was just so much dust for some reason. Well, our little baby daughter was sick all the time. And so we were back on a furlough here in the United States. Actually, I think we were in Wichita, Kansas at the time. Took her to the doctor. I still remember standing there, and the doctor said, "This baby's going to die if you don't get medicine." I said, "How long will it take for her to get well?" She said, "About 10 days. I went, "You mean from death to 10 days? She said, "Yes, you need medicine right now, but she will be fine, but not in the condition she's in." So when we got back to Brazil, literally, we were on a 3-month furlough. We get back, literally the first day we're there, I buy a newspaper to try to figure out what all's gone on since we've been out of town. They had arrested the man at the iron ore facility who was in charge of changing the filters. He had not changed the filters in 2 years. My daughter did not sin. The man at the facility who kept checking off that he was changing the filters, he was the one who sinned. We feel the impact of someone else's sin even though we don't have the sin. Y'all understand what I'm saying? Maybe this is a way to explain it too if you're a teacher. And you can use your own examples, obviously. We feel the impact, but it is not my sin. Adam and Eve sinned, Lamech sinned, Cain sinned, and everybody, by the time we get to Noah, is just full of sin. In Genesis chapter 4, Cain was full of envy, hypocrisy, and malice. And we talked about this some today, so I'm not going to spend too much time because you all need to take a nap, or you need to be able to turn up the sound on your phones right now for those of you watching the football game, and I know there's some of you. Don't think I wouldn't be watching with you. So, what's wrong with Cain's sacrifice? Well, it appears that he just brought fruit of the ground. Just. That maybe it wasn't special. It was just whatever he wanted to bring, like I told you about what my niece would bring, the Brussels sprouts and spinach in the can. Abel brought the firstborn of his flocks and the portions, and the difference is one is a sacrifice and one is just a way to recycle. So what was the point of the story with Cain and Abel? Well, I think a key point of the story is that Cain's sacrifice was unacceptable, and Yahweh is incredibly kind to Cain. Yahweh gives him an opportunity to repent. Yahweh urges him to repent, just like you might with your child. Is there anything you want to tell me? You think you want to do that a little bit differently than you just did it? Do you want to reword the way you just spoke to your mother? You see what I'm saying? Some of you know, and if the kid says no, oh boy, it's on, isn't it? Genesis 4:6, then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Now, there are a couple things that are really important about this passage. Number one is that sin can take us over if we don't do something. The other thing that's really important is God's grace. And finally, a third thing I think that is really, there's probably a fourth thing too, but a third thing here. He has the power to overcome his sin. Now, there are some sins that are more difficult than other sins. But at least here, he has the power, he can overcome it. He's going to have to take some steps that are pretty ugly. I don't know, he can't bring his brother back. It doesn't mean, oh, wow, if I just repent, then Abel is alive again. He can't do that. But there is a way that he could have been forgiven then. There is a way he could have said to God, what do you want me to do? And wouldn't that have been a really interesting conversation for us to have? What do you want me to do, God, now that he's dead? But he says you can overcome it. You must rule over it. So the world became an awful place. And by the time we get up to Noah, I want you to see Genesis 6:5 says, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. Wow. We live in a pretty evil place, but we are not that evil. There are good people all over San Antonio. There are good people all over Houston. There are people that are not thinking evil all the time. If you want to know how I know, I've been through some disasters in my life, and isn't it incredible how the good comes out in people? Y'all might remember we had a flood in Houston a few years ago, and people came from all over the country, even from other nations, and helped us. We had to the memorial congregation for 6 months. All we did was help people clean out their houses and help people who were in need and try to help in various needs. We had $990,000 come into just the memorial congregation. Every single gift was touching. But the $100 that came in from Haiti and the $200 that came in from India, wow, hit you right in the heart. There are good people out there. You're good people. So whenever we say, wow, I think it's just as bad as the time, no, it's not that bad yet. And let's pray we don't get that bad, but it's not that bad yet. But still, it was terrible in the time of Noah. God had made a man, and in a sense, he now decided to unmake him. I will destroy what I have created, but because of God's grace, he lets Noah live. Noah was the only righteous one left. Now, this is a thought question for those of you who are teachers. And if not, this is just something for you to think about in the car and talk about on the way home when you don't have the ball game on and you're talking to each other. What would it be like to be the only righteous person in your city, or in your neighborhood, or at your workplace, or in your family? I've never been in a city where I was the only person trying to do good. I hate to use the word righteous. I can only say I'm righteous through Jesus. But I bet some of you know what it's like to be the only Christian at your job. I bet some of you know what it's like where nobody cares about Jesus, where the language is horrific, where the things people do on the weekends are ungodly, where people are thinking about ways to steal rather than ways to do their jobs. And if you all don't know them, there are other people in this congregation that do. Some of you know what it's like to be the only person in your family to be a Christian, that no one else is interested. One of the groups, I always, when I preach, often I try to stop and think about the congregation. I think about who I'm going to preach to. A thing that I read in a book many, many years ago, I don't even remember who from, that I now do is I will often walk through the auditorium during the week. Usually I don't turn on the lights. I just walk through it. All of us have habits. People often sit in the same places, and I try to pray for those people that I know where they sit. And I'll go row to row to row to row. Doesn't take a long time to do necessarily. Sometimes it does. But I will try to pray for people that are in those places. One of the groups that always touches me is when I remember the single women or the married women who are coming to church all by themselves. And they have a husband at home that is not excited about them being there. Many years ago, when we lived in Oklahoma, there was a woman that came to church. Her husband didn't. She had 2 little girls, and her girls' ages were the same exact age as our girls, so we became friends. She told me one time, she said, if I had it all to do over again, I would have never married my husband. I said, well, he's a good man. I knew him, but he didn't come to church. I said, he's a good man. He said, you don't mean that. She goes, oh, yes, I do. I said, why do you mean that? Why are you saying that? She said, I have to leave the moment church is over because he wants me home in order to cook or to go out to eat as soon as it's over. I'm not allowed to put any money in the collection plate because he doesn't think that's a good thing. We need it for the family. I'm not allowed to go to any class party. I'm not allowed to do anything at church unless it's right in the 2 hours on Sunday morning. I can't do anything. I pray for those kind of people. And I also pray for their spouses. Now, one of the most beautiful things was before we left, he was baptized into Christ. What got him wasn't all the words I thought I was trying to use to him. It was the movie The Passion that moved him toward the Lord. We rented out a couple of theaters when it came out, and then we had everybody come back to the building. We talked about maybe some of the things that had been changed a little bit, and then we talked about the power of the sacrifice Jesus made. And he was like, where's the water? I'm ready. And he has stayed faithful. But I think about those people. They would understand Noah, what it's like to be the only righteous one in the family or in the workplace. Noah was the only righteous one left. So the Noah account is the end of a society in moral breakdown. So that's what you see in Genesis 6 through 10. It's interesting that the world needed washed through the flood to be cleansed from the evil. You remember that passage in 1 Peter that talks about baptism and Noah, and kind of odd passage? Like, where did that come from? There is a sense that what God is doing here is he is washing his creation. He is cleansing it from the evil that's there. When we go into baptism, that sin, so to speak, dies. And in this case, the sinners are dying in Noah's day. So I want to answer a question for just a few minutes, because some of you get this, or you're going to ask me, what's happening with the Nephilim, or Nephilim, we should say? What's happening with those? Do you all know what I'm talking about? Okay, we'll read this odd passage. As a preacher, I like to skip over this verse. So, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 1, when mankind began to multiply on the earth and daughters were born to men, the sons of God saw that the daughters of mankind were beautiful, and they took any they chose as wives for themselves, and the Lord said, my spirit will not remain with mankind forever, because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. Then he goes on, we're not reading all the verses, but verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth both in those days and afterward, and when the sons of God came to the daughters of mankind who bore children to them, they were powerful men of old, the famous men. That is one weird passage. And at the end of the day, this is what I'm going to tell you. I'm not sure. That's the answer, okay? Now we'll move on to verse 5. There's an old, well-known commentary set that anytime it's a tough subject, I've noticed they always skip that part. Just go to the next one. So what all's happening there? And I don't have all the answers, but I have some things that I'm going to propose here for just a minute. Some have said that what you have here are sinful angels who came to be with human females, that's what's happening. Others have said possibly it's the lines of Cain and Seth intermarrying. That's probably not the way I'd go, but that's what some have said. Whatever it is, well, I'm going to wait until I say that part. I want to tell you about the Nephilim here for a minute. The original audience knew what it meant. The original audience knows who the Nephilim are. Sometimes there are things that we think that we don't need to be explained because all of us in the room know, right? Like I'm trying to think of an example. In 100 years, let's say that, we may not know what the Gulf of America is. Or we may not know what the Gulf of Mexico is, however that turns out. But in the moment, we all know, right? And so I wouldn't have to write think, I'm going to be writing so people, 3,000 years later can know what I'm writing about. I wouldn't stop to write that. So what I know is the original audience knows what the Nephilim are. I don't have to always know. It's not important. Although it is a fun thing. Once again, if we go on a car ride together, we can talk about it from one Buc-ee's to the next. I mean, we have a lot of time to do that. But I'm going to give you a little bit of what I think it may be, and these are not my thoughts, but I borrowed these, that they were men from myths that supposedly had great strength. For example, some of you have heard of the Gilgamesh myth. If you can Google Gilgamesh if you want to and find out about him. This whole story of Gilgamesh is made up of 5 poems, and Gilgamesh is a hero that is supposedly part human, part God. It is believed that Gilgamesh was a real person But then the stories started, one story after another, about how great he was. Incidentally, the kings of Ur worshipped Gilgamesh. Do you remember Ur, where Abraham was from this morning? So the kings of Ur would worship him. But the stories of how great Gilgamesh went from just a man to now all at once being more powerful than just a man. He was kind of like the Chuck Norris of his day. If people ever read the story, the things said about Chuck Norris, they're going to think, wow, what a guy is he. But, he's just a guy that a bunch of stories are made up about. And these stories existed before the angels came down and after. And they existed. You will find the Nephilim stories later on. Whenever the spies, for example, go into the land, they'll talk about the Nephilim again. Once again, this is just David talking. You all can probably shoot this down, but this is where I'm leaning for the moment. The Gilgamesh poems and stories were around before the time of Noah, and they were around after the time of Noah, and people said, there's the Nephilim right there. That's what that is. Well, and you'd say, well, who would have told them? Noah's family. Noah's family are the only people, considering that all known humanity is wiped out, Noah's family carried it from one side to the other. Noah was righteous. The Bible never says that his family was righteous. I'd like to think they were righteous, but there's nothing that ever says they're righteous. So they might have just continued to tell the stories, some of them. Stories of this God, this man God. And so later on, when Israel sees the Nephilim, they're not really part God, part man, but instead that's what they project onto what they see. Just like we might, if we saw somebody incredibly strong, or somebody that was could do incredible gymnastics or taekwondo, if we were to see a Bruce Lee or a Bruce Lee type movie when they fly through the air. So, the account of Noah, I want you to see some of this about the account of Noah, about God and his covenant. God's nature would not allow him to kill Noah because Noah was upright. God's nature does not allow him to go against the one that is good. God showed him grace not only by letting him live, but by saving his family. First of all, you realize it's going to be very difficult to repopulate the world if you only have Noah, right? That's number one. But he's also showing grace to Noah. Noah is not going to be on the ark all by himself all that time. Several years ago, I was in Philadelphia, and one of the things I'm really blessed with is I get to go on these trips. The church lets me go on these trips once a year. I get to pick where I go. I'm gone usually 10 days to 2 weeks, and they are sermon writing trips where I go and I get inspired by whatever I see. I've been to Chicago. I've been to Washington, D.C. I've been on a restoration history tour that I did, that I've self-created, went to all the places that are important in our history, in Churches of Christ, or many of them at least. And a few years ago, I went to Philadelphia. One of the places that was really interesting to go to was to the First Penitentiary. Now, there aren't many people that go see the penitentiary in Philadelphia, but I did. And there's, if you do go and you don't want to go, but part of your family wants to, there's a nice coffee shop across the street. Benjamin Franklin was one of the people that founded this penitentiary. The word penance penitentiary comes from the word penance. So what they did in this penitentiary that just closed as a prison in the 1980s is they had these very small cells without much light, some natural light, very tiny area, and right behind it would be a place that the prisoner could go outside, but that was only open to him 1 hour per day, and then the prisoner had to stay in this little tiny facility and was not allowed to speak. Now, before this, all prisoners were put in the same cell. And that was, you had a horse thief, and you had a murderer, and you had a pickpocket, and that was terrible. So this was the new way they were going to do things in the late 1700s. And so everybody would be by themselves, but you could not speak. You couldn't read, you couldn't speak. You were in solitary confinement doing penance. You only had to stay 5 years. But you know what the problem was? People went crazy. They lost their minds. I want you to imagine if Noah is on the ark when all of humanity has died and he is by himself. God has provided grace and also provided for his mental health in the midst of all of this, that he would be able to take care of the animals, but then also his mental health would be well. So God made a covenant with Noah that God will never destroy the earth by water. So God puts, we know, you have probably told your kids this story when you see the rainbow. Kids, you know what that is? That's a rainbow. What does a rainbow mean? God will never destroy the earth by fire again. Earth by water again. Won't be water, but fire next time. Do y'all know that song? I'll never destroy the earth again by water. Now, this term rainbow, obviously, it's used by the LGBTQ community, but besides that, apart from that, the rainbow is kind of this happy term, right? It's been happy, and it's the little marshmallows in the cereal, right, for Lucky Charms or something. And you know, you can buy just the marshmallows by themselves now. I saw them. You don't even have to buy the cereal. Wow, this is great. But the rainbow was not called rainbow. It was a bow. And you know what a bow was for? You shoot a bow. There are two different people, two different schools on this. One is that the bow was God putting down his bow after killing humanity. There's another view. You realize where that bow is pointed. It's pointed straight up. God saying, if I go back on my covenant, you can shoot me. Because God does not go back on his covenant. God does not go back. Ever, ever, ever. And so, that is not a story I teach the kids, that part, incidentally. But that is a possibility. Whatever is happening there, it is, I think it was considered at least a symbol of a weapon. And you may not agree, that's okay. I mean, I don't have nothing against you if you don't agree with me. I've been married almost 35 years, and we don't agree on anything. I mean, that's it. Boy, just wait until we're in the same car. So, I'm really being sort of funny. But the bow is this weapon that now will remind us that God will never do that again. We're going to talk about this more in just a little bit in a second, in the last session. So there becomes, this is another ponder question that I like. If you were in a Bible class, what was the PTSD like for Noah? If I understand right, PTS is something that you have for a while. PTSD is something that you have for a long time, that you live with forever. After, many of you, obviously you remember the flood of Houston, and you all said, boy, I'm really glad I don't live in Houston. I also know that a lot of you, before there ever was a flood, you were saying, I'm really glad I don't live in Houston. But we had, at our house, 51 inches of rain in about 2.5 days. It was overwhelming. We have a creek right outside our back gate. I was able to look it up. I didn't even know I could find this out, but we were we were less than an inch and a half of that creek coming over the top. I mean, it's a deep thing. The city has gone in, or the county, and made it deeper for things like this. But it plays on your mind when it rains and rains and rains, and I love rain. It just wouldn't stop. You know what it's like when it's coming down in buckets and it comes down for 30 minutes? 24, 25, 26, 27 hours, and it doesn't stop. We have flood insurance. I remember the night I said to my wife, I said, as we got in bed, I said, and I was looking at the floor, and I said, you know, we may wake up in the morning and this all be wet. And she said, and we will thank God for the blessings that we have had and that we will have. I said, that's right. So I woke up a couple of times in the night and thought, is the bed floating? You know, I was trying to figure out, do we have a water bed? The next time it rained right at rush hour. And there were wrecks all over the city. It only rained maybe half an inch. But people who were driving recklessly and so fast, there were reports on the news about it, people who were scared because of what had happened in the past. PTS or PTSD. One of the things that I've said several times, I've never said it publicly, you remember that Noah builds a vineyard, and he's found drunk. He should not be drunk. Let's say that right away. But afterwards, I said to my wife, I said, you know what Noah was doing? I've never even thought about this. He was medicating. He had been through something pretty rough. Wow, I can't even imagine what it would be like to be in a situation like that. The reason I'm telling you these things is because these are things you can draw out of these ancient stories that will apply to people today. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I want you to be able to see that this is not just some old book that's full of dust. But even though this is some of the earliest writing of the Bible, there are things there that we can go, wow, that applies to people who live in San Antonio. This makes sense. There are things I can draw out and still apply that my children and grandchildren, my neighbor, whoever can understand and figure out. So, there would now be a new civilization. There is obviously the sin that occurred between Noah and his son, and there's that awfulness that things are no better than they were before. So now there will be a new civilization known as Babel, or officially, I think we're supposed to say Babel, but hey, we say Babel in this part of the world, at least in mine. And so they build a tower, a Babel, the ziggurat. Have you ever seen a ziggurat? Kind of has steps and goes up, and you can still see these over ancient Israel. Matter of fact, if you have the History Channel, they will tell you they can find the actual tower. I'm not really sure they have, but they will tell you that they can find the actual tower for you, or part of it. And towers aren't sinful. But the purpose often of a tower is to make a name for yourself, and the problem with making a name for ourselves then can easily become sinful. In and of itself, it's not a sin to make a name for yourself, depending on what you're going to do with your name. If it is somehow to draw people toward God, that can be a good thing. Let your light shine before men so that they may see your good deeds, but glorify your Father who is in heaven. So it's not in and of itself wrong if I'm trying to lead people toward Jesus. But that's not what they were doing. They weren't trying to bring people toward God. This is one of the oddest stories in some ways in the Bible. God is using phrases that people of that era knew and understood by God coming down and looking at it and what he did there. But they couldn't reach God no matter what they did. We know, because we have known of airplanes and rockets and space shuttles, they were never going to reach God. God did them a great favor because it was never going to happen. And to quote Barney Fife, he nipped it in the bud. So the new civilization of Babel, God stopped them because they were sinful and they were foolish. He wanted them to fill the earth because that's what they had been commanded to do, to fill the earth. I've been asked by people before, is that still something that we're supposed to do? Someone not long ago asked me if each couple should have at least 3 children because we're supposed to leave with more than what we have. I don't think that's necessarily a command to us. There are over 8 billion people on the planet, so I'm not sure that's a command for us. If so, I have not quite done the right thing because of only having 2 children. But that was certainly what God had intended at that time because there were very few people on the planet. The discipline was what the people needed. Their languages, however that happens, the languages are become confusing, and people go one way and people go another way, and somehow God has his plan work even though the people don't understand it or maybe even necessarily like it. God's will be done always. We have a very small Chinese ministry at Memorial. Back a few years ago, I was asked to teach it. While the teacher, the Chinese minister was out of town, I was asked to teach the Chinese group. And I taught 2 weeks, and no one had any questions like the teachers here last night had no questions when I asked them. And then I found out why. Finally, someone raised their hand and said, "We don't speak English." Oh, and you had me as your teacher for 2 weeks. Thanks a lot. So I found some videos that were subtitled so I could know what was being said. And one of the things it did was it went back to some of the ancient Chinese letters that looked like it was about telling the story of Adam and Eve and a garden and a serpent and all these different things. It was very interesting, and the folks in the class thought it was interesting as well because obviously it was their language. If that is the case, and I don't know, I'm just telling you, if that is the case, you would know when probably a group left to go east would have been at this time of Babel. Be kind of interesting, huh? Okay. We're going to take our break because y'all are dying and you're so nice looking at me and not sleeping. I can't believe it. It's going to be the last one, and then everybody gets to go home. All right?